Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening and welcome to yet another edition of the Special Focus. My name is Zahid Jadwat and today we are together once again until 8 p.m. Now, along with the COVID-19 pandemic, the World Health Organization has spoken of an infodemic that has spread all over social media platforms. And I'm sure you have received at least one of those many odd messages doing the rounds, because certainly I have come across tons of them, from suggestions that 5G technology has created the coronavirus to stories that frame Bill Gates as a sly mass murderer. Misinformation and conspiracy theories can sound quite tempting to believe at times. However, much of it might be inaccurate and could be potentially dangerous. So tonight we are speaking to a panel of psychological experts, misinformation researchers, and conspiracy theory researchers to find out just how much one should believe and what are the dangers of misinformation and conspiracy theories that often thrive on social media. Now, to begin with, let me welcome our guests for this evening. Firstly, we have Professor John Cook, who is a cognitive science researcher at the George Mason University in the United States. John has co-authored the college textbooks Climate Change Examining the Facts and Climate Change Science, a Modern Synthesis, and he has also co-authored the book Climate Change Denial Heads in the Sand. In 2013, he published a paper finding 97% scientific consensus on human-caused global warming, a finding that was highlighted by US President Barack Obama and UK Prime Minister David Cameron. He currently co-hosts with Peter Jacobs the podcast Evidence Squared on the science of science communication, and he is the creator of the Cranky Uncle app to help users spot policies of climate denial. So basically, he has been doing quite a bit of work researching conspiracy theories. Welcome, Professor John Cook, to the show.
Thanks, Zahid. Thanks for having me.
And we also have Professor Stephan Lewandowsky, who is a chair of cognitive psychology at the School of Psychological Science at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. His research has focused on the public's understanding of science and why people often embrace beliefs that are sharply at odds with scientific evidence. He has also written a number of books on the research that he's done. With John Cook, who is a fellow panelist as well, Mr. Lewandowsky has written the Debunking Handbook. That was in 2011, and that's for the a review of research on debunking falsehood and a guide to better practices for doing so. Welcome, Professor Lewandowsky.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
We also have Dr. Sander van der Linden, who is an assistant professor and lecturer in social psychology at the University of Cambridge. He has directed the Cambridge Social Decision-Making Laboratory since 2016, and he was named a rising star by the Association for Psychological Science. He's particularly known for his research on the psychology of social issues such as fake news and climate change. His research is regularly featured on outlets such as the New York Times, the BBC, CNN, The Economist, NPR, The Washington Post, and Time Magazine. Welcome to the show, Professor Dr. Sander van der Linden.
Pleasure to be on the show.
And we also have one more guest. We have Professor Joseph Uscinski, who is an associate professor at the University of Miami's Political Science Department. He's the author of several academic publications. In 2015, Uscinski organized and convened the first international conference on conspiracy theory research in Miami. The conference featured more than 50 scholars from 10 different countries. Welcome to the show to you as well.
Thank you.
Now, before we begin with the show, let me just remind the listeners that you can send us your comments and questions on WhatsApp. You can use the number 061-766-0355, or you can tweet and tag @Salam Media on Twitter. Now, to begin with tonight's discussion, let's start with you, Professor Lewandowsky. Firstly, how can one identify and respond to conspiracy theories? You have co-authored the Conspiracy Theory Handbook with Professor John Cook, who is a fellow panelist, in fact, in which you outline the 7 traits on conspiratorial thinking, Professor Lewandowsky.
Yeah, that's a very good question, of course, because one of the things we have to start out with is to recognize that true conspiracies exist. And so we're in this sort of position where we have to make sure that when we're talking about a conspiracy theory, that we are talking about something that is unlikely to be true. And the approach that John and I and other colleagues have taken is to analyze the cognition of people who are believing in conspiracy theories and how they talk about the world and how they spread their conspiracy theories. And when you do that, then you find out that their cognition and their rhetoric is actually quite different from that of standard evidence-based thinking. And as you said, there are 7 of these markers. I'll just go through, 1 or 2 of them. To me, the most interesting marker is the incoherence that is inherent in a conspiracy theory. Most conspiracy theories are not coherent. They contain internal contradictions. So, for example, we've recently had conspiracy theories about COVID, where the same person will argue within minutes of being interviewed in the same interview. On the one hand, the COVID virus has been with us since we were children because we got it through vaccinations when we were kids. But 3 minutes later in the same interview, they'll say, oh, no, that's a new chemical weapon or biological weapon that came out of a laboratory in China. Well, it's either one or the other, but not both. And in the event, it actually is neither in this particular case. But so we have this incoherence, and the moment somebody is incoherent, you can basically already say, well, there's something wrong here. And that's just one example of how you can detect flawed reasoning that is indicative of somebody holding beliefs that are probably not going to be aligned with reality. And that's a starting point.
And of course, misinformation is also one of the other problems which perhaps I would understand feed conspiracy theories. And so, Professor John Cook, I want you to just analyze that point there. Is there any relation between misinformation and conspiracy theories?
Yeah, so one way to look at it, which I find is a very fruitful approach, is looking at the techniques, the rhetorical techniques, the logical fallacies that you find in misinformation. And when you look at it that way, we see a range of telltale techniques in misinformation, fake experts, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories is one of those techniques that we find within misinformation and science denial in general. So I would characterize the relationship between misinformation and conspiracy theories is that conspiracy theories is one subset of misinformation more broadly. And that also means that the techniques, the approaches that we've developed in response to misinformation also can apply as one approach to responding to conspiracy theories, which is building people's resilience and inoculating people by explaining to them the ways, the techniques, or the traits of conspiratorial thinking that can lead people to be misled.
And just exactly about trying to get people to be resilient against conspiracy theories, there's a question again for you, Professor Lewandowsky. The question is, what makes people believe in conspiracy theories and ignore the scientific fact? In fact, much of the debunking handbook which you've written focuses on backfire effects, so-called backfire effects, whereby telling people that they are wrong often reinforces their prior beliefs rather than weakening them, correct?
Yes. Now, there's actually 2 questions in there. Let me take them up in turn. The first question is, why do people believe in conspiracy theories? And we have a pretty good answer to that based on a lot of research. And basically what happens is that some people resort to conspiracy theories whenever they feel that they have lost control or that they're threatened by events in their lives. And that is why any frightening event, from 9/11 to mass shootings in the US, are invariably accompanied by conspiracy theories. Anything unexpected, that is a huge big deal. People are reluctant to accept a mundane explanation. They want something that is big and evil to explain these terrible things. So, for example, when Princess Diana died in a car crash in Paris some time ago, I mean, that was sort of a very mundane thing. It was just some drunk who killed her in a car crash. but then a lot of people started believing in conspiracy theories because they felt that this major, massive event, taking the life of this beautiful woman, must have a big explanation. And so whenever you have an event that is big, that is threatening people's sense of control, that makes them feel that, they're scared, that's when they will start to believe in conspiracy theories. And so the question then is, what do you do? How do you talk to people like that? Now, you're absolutely right that sometimes under certain conditions, there are these backfire effects. That means if you try to talk somebody out of an opinion they hold, they actually become more entrenched. However, and this is a very important point to make, backfire effects are far less common, I think, than we first thought about 10 years ago when we started out doing this research. Initially, our concern much broader, that by simply trying to debunk something, that occasionally you might make the myth so familiar that people believe it more than before. Well, fortunately, it turns out that was we were too concerned about that. And what we now know is that if you do get a backfire effect, it probably is only in very specific situations where the person who you're trying to talk to is extremely committed to a belief, and they consider that belief to be part of their identity. So with conspiracy theorists, there is some evidence that with hardcore believers in conspiracy theories, you may in fact have very little success in trying to debunk the theory. However, if you're talking about people who've just kind of heard of a conspiracy, or who are kind of sort of, they're just mentioning it because it kind of sounds plausible, with those more mainstream people, you can actually achieve a change in belief if you debunk a conspiracy theory. Certainly, there's a lot of evidence now to suggest that. So you don't always get a backfire effect, and I think that's very important to drive that home.
Just before we move on, I just want to clarify one point, Professor Lewandowsky. What exactly makes people cling onto these theories? Is it something like perhaps some psychological support or comfort that's being offered by these theories to the people who are speaking about these theories and believing in them?
Indeed, that's the flip side of what I was saying at the beginning, that people resort to this whenever they feel they've lost control or they're frightened. And under those circumstances, a conspiracy theory offers some sort of psychological comfort. It's chicken soup for the soul. It kind of makes you feel a little better about the world, because even though something really terrible has happened, if you can explain that by saying there's this group of really evil people who is responsible, then that opens the door to the possibility that if those people hadn't been that bad, this bad thing wouldn't have happened. And that gives you a little bit of a sense of control, just at least hypothetically, whereas a random drunk driving accident or a virus that some bat sneezes on a guy in China in a cave and now we're all locked down, which is basically what happened, that explanation doesn't offer control. Whereas if you say there's a secret weapons laboratory and there are really bad people doing this to us, then there at least you could imagine that these guys would not be that bad, and so there seems to be some sense of comfort derived from that, ironically, but that is how people seem to think.
Okay, if you've just tuned in, my name is Zahid Jadwat. This is the Special Focus, and we are together until 8 p.m. right here on Solar Media. We are discussing conspiracy theories. What do they mean? Why do they exist? Why do people believe in them? And basically just all about conspiracy theories and misinformation. But it's time now for us to take an ad break, and when we get back, we will, of course, dig deeper into this discussion. Remember that if you want to join this discussion as a listener, you can send your comments via a WhatsApp to 06176603 355. Alternatively, you can tweet and tag at Salam Media on Twitter, or you can drop your comment below on YouTube or on our Facebook Live. If you are listening and you don't necessarily have a comment or question for our guests, then please do at least just send us a thumbs up so that we know you are listening, and we will. And if you have questions, we will gladly air those questions for you. But now let's take an ad break, and when we get back, we will dig deeper. Stay tuned. And welcome back. My name is Zahid Jadwat. This is the Special Focus, and you are tuned to Salam Media. We are discussing conspiracy theories. Should you believe them? What is the damage that these theories cause, and why do people believe them in the first place? Let me just remind you, our guests this evening. Firstly, we have Professor John Cook, who is a cognitive science researcher at the George Mason University in the United States of America. We also have Professor Stephan Lewandowsky, who is a chair of cognitive psychology at the School of Psychological Science at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. And we have Dr. Sander van der Linden, who is an assistant professor and lecturer in social psychology at the University of Cambridge. Finally, we have Professor Joseph Uscinski, who is an associate professor at the University of Miami's Political Science Department, and he's an author of several academic publications. Now, Dr. van der Linden, welcome to the show. A question for you is, why is it generally the case that influential people, people like Bill Gates, for example, are generally at the center of all these conspiracy theories? Dr. Sander van der Linden?
Yeah, generally you see that many conspiracy theories have themes that relate to power, money, death, religion. Those are common themes that are present in most conspiracy theories. And they often need a powerful enemy to blame for the conspiracy. And so often that will be somebody of high status, somebody who is seen as an elite, somebody who has the resources. In order for the conspiracy to be plausible, you need to have a characterization of somebody who appears that they can actually implement a conspiracy, right? Because they know a lot of people, they're in the network, they have the money available. Because if you pick up some, everyday guy like us from the, university, nobody's going to believe we're in on the conspiracy. Maybe except when it comes to climate change. And I know Steve is shaking his head. That's right. We could be the target of conspiracies. I guess that's true. But generally, that's the profile when you're perceived as elitist. And in fact, it might be the case that some professors are indeed perceived as elitist and part of a particular institution that is seen as threatening people's worldview. So that's part of it. But it's not just powerful people that are in a particular position that are seen as the propagators of evil by the conspiracy theorists. It's often also outgroups that are people that are considered not part of the group that are the target of the conspiracy. And so, for example, Jewish individuals are blamed for the COVID-19 pandemic. Religious and ethnic minority groups are often blamed for conspiring in secret against those who feel oppressed. And so you see that often the targets of conspiracy theories are either groups who are marginalized or have some minority status that are easily blamed for a particular event throughout history. For example, when you take the Jewish people as an example, they were also blamed for the plague. And throughout history, people have concocted these narratives about particular groups in society, and they keep recurring throughout the ages. So that's a very consistent pattern. But basically, it doesn't always have to be a powerful elite, but that's often, how the cookie crumbles. And I think the example you brought up by Bill Gates is often about the New World Order conspiracy. So there's a lot of conspiracies that are about globalist, left-wing institutions that are thought to create a new world order where everything and everyone's connected, and Bill Gates is going to inject you with microchips and track your every move. So the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the European Union, they're all part of the globalist conspiracy. So there's a whole domain of people who are keen on floating these kinds of conspiracies because that's threatening to their worldview. But there's others too that blame groups in society for things that have gone wrong, and they're part of the conspiracy. So I think there's some diversity.
And Professor Uscinski, I will come back to you in a short while. But just before I get to you, Professor John Cook, a question that then arises is, how likely is it that any one of these conspiracy theories could actually be true?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. And it's the reason why in the Conspiracy Theory Handbook that we started by stressing that real conspiracies do exist. So we do need to be able to have the ability to distinguish between a baseless conspiracy theory and real conspiracies. And so we provide strategies to help people with that. Looking for the red flags of a baseless conspiracy theory in contrast to what an actual conspiracy, real conspiracy might look like. And some of those traits, or some of the contrast between the two, is that the way that real conspiracies have been uncovered were done through conventional means, people showing healthy skepticism and being responsive to evidence. But if you encounter someone who's promoting a conspiracy theory where they're showing nihilistic skepticism, like an overwhelming skepticism of any data or information, and they're unresponsive or immune to evidence, if they reinterpret random events as being part of this broader pattern, those are those red flags of a potential baseless conspiracy, and can help you to spot what is more likely to be a baseless conspiracy theory. And let me give you a quick example, and I'm going to kind of fact check Sander for briefly in a very gentle way. You mentioned how academics don't always aren't the target of a conspiracy theory.
No, we can't take that statement. Having thought about it now, I think we've all been the target of conspiracy theories. So yeah, go ahead, John. Debunk that statement.
So I'm only bringing this not to ping Sander, but more to try to illustrate my point. A few years back, Stephan Lewandowsky published some research linking climate denial with conspiratorial thinking. And the response to this research from climate deniers were to publish all these conspiracy theories explaining his research results. And we watched kind of amazed as the conspiracy theories became more and more complex and convoluted and bigger. The government was involved, then suddenly I was involved, and by the end of it, Steve was like the overlord of the universe, pulling the strings of society. So sometimes academics do get pulled into these conspiracy theories.
Oh, you better be careful what you say.
Okay, so Professor Joseph Uscinski, now I understand that you have written somewhere along the lines that COVID-19 has created the perfect storm for conspiracy theorists. And about the coronavirus that's currently spreading across the world, there are many theories which have, of course, inevitably these theories have surfaced. So you might want to elaborate on your statement that perhaps it's the perfect storm for conspiracy theorists.
Well, as a social scientist, if I was to run an experiment where I wanted to find out how many people I could turn into a conspiracy theorist, I couldn't do it better than what COVID has done for me. So if you think about the conditions that we have all been facing, first of all, we're facing a deadly virus and a worldwide pandemic, and that in itself is going to make people scared and feel very uncertain. They're going to feel powerless, and they're going to have a lack of control over their own lives because of the virus itself. But then on top of that, we have the economic uncertainty and the government shutdowns that we've had to face too. And that can bring up social isolation, economic issues. And then even on top of that, as if that wasn't enough. In my country, we have the primaries going on. We're going into the November elections. So there are a lot of political motivations that are swarming around. And on top of that, we have a president who has been going on TV almost every day during the first month of the pandemic, spreading all sorts of misinformation and conspiracy theories. And in fact, one of the first things that he said was that the COVID-19 was the Democrats' new hoax. If you put all of those things together, on top of the fact that we are all paying attention to this one thing at the same time, day in, day out, all day, and it's affecting all parts of our lives, that is where our attention is going to be focused. And if we are going to fall into conspiracy explanations, that is what we are going to explain with our conspiracy theories. And the data bears this out. So when we polled early on in March and asked people if they thought that COVID-19 was a bioweapon, we got about 1 in 3 Americans who agreed that it was. When we asked, on the other hand, if COVID-19 was being exaggerated to injure President Trump going into an election year, again, we got 1 in 3 Americans believing that. And for conspiracy theories, that's pretty high numbers, because even birther and truther theories for a number of years didn't reach 30%. So to go over 30% is pretty, those are pretty strong beliefs. And it's not clear how those are going to play out over time. They may very well wind up going up as this drags on. If we get hit with a very strong second wave, those beliefs could very much increase if we have to do another lockdown. And the fact that many of our political and media elites are engaging in this rhetoric does not help matters. That we have a president with a bully pulpit who pushes these theories on a daily basis, and that that the media personalities who appeal to the president's audience also engage in this, sometimes with very dangerous conspiracy theories. For example, they have encouraged people to go to hospitals and film the hospitals to be sure that there's actually COVID patients there. So in short, there's a lot of factors that are driving this right now. And if there is a perfect storm for conspiracy theorizing, this is probably it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Dr. Sander van der Linden, I want you to come in and comment on what you think is what impact do these conspiracy theories have on the public understanding of major issues like the coronavirus, for example, climate change, for example, and in fact, Professor Uscinski has touched quite a bit on the political impact of conspiracy theories. Dr. Sander?
Yeah, no, I agree with everyone that clearly some conspiracies have happened in the past, but widespread belief in unfounded conspiracies can be very problematic. I should say that some of our colleagues think that fake news isn't that big of an issue in terms of its actual impact. However, I think that there's enough reason to be skeptical of that claim in a sense that there appears to be a direct link, particularly between certain conspiracy theories and societal impact. If you think about conspiracies about, vaccination, for example, here in the UK, back in the 90s, it had the link between autism and vaccines, which of course was later debunked, had a huge impact on public health. Conspiracy theories that spread through WhatsApp platforms in India have led to mob lynchings and death. COVID-19 conspiracies about the 5G cellular network exacerbating symptoms has led people, at least in the UK, set ablaze 50 phone masts that were set on fire by people because they acted on a false conspiracy theory. President Trump in the US is pushing the idea that injecting yourself, right, with bleach is a cure for the virus. There's been debate on how many people have actually followed that health advice. But I think there's plenty of evidence to say that there is a direct link between the societal impact and the beliefs that people endorse and subsequently act upon. I think there's a difference between people holding a belief and those who are acting on those beliefs, but they can be dangerous for various reasons. With climate change, for example, the fact that people deny climate change because they believe in false conspiracy theories is presenting a huge hurdle to mitigating one of the biggest risks of our time, right? It has a very real impact, especially for populations who are already experiencing the impacts of climate change, right? There's people who are denying the evidence that can be very problematic for policy progress. But also on other issues, international relations. People, when the president has conspiracy theories about other countries and their intentions, you get what is often referred to as the paranoid style of American politics, which for decades has been governed by a sense of paranoia about international and domestic politics. So I would say that it's a very real phenomenon, a real worry that conspiracy theories can have a negative societal impact, and they're not just harmless fun. It's not just an individual out in the desert looking for aliens. I think they can do real damage.
And so, of course, to implement a lockdown, I'm sure would be quite a challenge when you have many people believing these conspiracy theories and therefore denying that such a virus does exist. Of course, they would be more likely to break such lockdown regulations. But that's just a side comment, by the way. Now, coming back to the coronavirus. So let's now discuss one of the most popular conspiracy theories which have come about with the coronavirus pandemic. So this theory now suggests that the COVID-19 pandemic was specifically engineered in order for certain people to profit from vaccines and the industries related to combating the virus. So the theory is perpetuated in documentaries like Plandemic. I'm sure you are aware of that, quite a popular documentary which done the rounds. Although it was taken down, I'm sure quite a few millions must have watched that documentary. So that documentary seems to have gained quite a bit of popularity amongst those skeptical about buying into the official narrative about COVID-19. Professor Lewandowski, do you take issue with this particular documentary? Why is that?
Well, that's a wonderful example because that's one of the many things that's incoherent about it. Because on the one hand, they say that this virus was created by, who knows, Bill Gates, George Soros, the world government, to kill us all. But then 3 minutes later, they say, oh, well, the virus is there so that the pharmaceutical industry can make a lot of money to vaccinate us. Now, if we're all dead, how are they going to sell us a vaccine? That doesn't make sense. So, they can't even get the story straight. I mean, either this thing was created to kill us all, or it was created to keep a lot of us alive so we can still pay for the vaccine. And so that's a classic case of, incoherence. And that alone should be enough to dismiss that whole thing. And beyond that, I mean, the idea that, governments would shut down their own economies and go through all this trouble just because the pharmaceutical industry wants to sell some vaccines. Well, I mean, it's absurd before you even start thinking about it. And the moment you do, I think it goes out the window. But as I said, you don't even have to go that far. It's just that they're incoherent. And so, that's just nonsense. Let's not waste our time on really, dwelling on that too much. What I think is important is to understand why people believe those kinds of things and how you can help them detect that they're being misled. And that is some of the research that the three of us here, actually, John, Sander, and I don't know about Joe, but we've been working on inoculation techniques, cognitive vaccines that help people become resilient to being misled by telling them ahead of time how they will be misled. And that is one of the things specifically with vaccinations that a colleague of ours, Karen Douglas, has shown, that if you tell people ahead of time that they will encounter conspiracy theories about vaccines, they then are able to dismiss that, and it doesn't affect their intention to vaccinate. Whereas if it goes the other way around, then exposure to the conspiracy theory has a negative consequence, which is to reduce people's willingness to vaccinate. And that's one of the many things I think Sander also mentioned about the negative fallouts from a conspiracy theory.
And just before we take our final ad break for the show, would any one of the other panelists like to comment on that as well, the pandemic documentary?
Well, one thing I'd like to say is, just following on from what Steve said, it was interesting that when the documentary maker of Plandemic was asked, do you actually believe that someone has intentionally engineered coronavirus? His answer was, I don't know, but something must be going on. So he doesn't actually have a coherent account or a coherent kind of explanation of coronavirus. All he knows is there must be some conspiracy, something must be wrong. And
also, if I can just interject, another funny thing is that when these characters were asked to produce their evidence for all these claims, all these ridiculous claims, one of them said, the interviewer said, "Oh, I don't have any," and the other person, that woman who, by the way, has she's totally discredited within the scientific community for reasons having nothing to do with this video. It goes way back. She refused to respond to the question and didn't get back to whoever emailed her about the evidence. So it's a classic case of just two entrepreneurs going out there selling some bizarre conspiracy theory in exchange for attention. We're talking about them. Well, for them, that's great. We live in an attention economy where any click on a video or whatever is money for someone, for an advertiser or for the person who's selling the video or who then has radio interviews, And so we have to be very careful in all of this that we don't inadvertently reward people for coming up with this stuff, because in an attention economy, what matters is not whether you're right or wrong, but whether people talking about it. And that is a real trap that is extremely difficult to get out of.
And just hold that thought about one of the guests who featured in that documentary. I think it was Dr. Judy Mikovits, the discredited interviewee. I just want to say something about that as well. I have a question about that and the interventions which we are taking to combat the spread of conspiracy theories. But let's just take a quick ad break, and when we get back, then we will get into that. Please do stay tuned. and welcome back to the Special Focus. My name is Zahid Jadwat. The time now is 19:42, which means we just have we have about 18 minutes remaining until the end of the show. So let me remind you, we are speaking about conspiracy theories, whether we should believe them or not. And our guests are Professor John Cook, who is a cognitive science researcher at the George Mason University. We have Professor Stephan Lewandowsky, who is the chair of cognitive psychology at the School of Psychological Science at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. We also have Dr. Sander van der Linden, who is an assistant professor and lecturer in social psychology at the University of Cambridge, also in the United Kingdom. And we have Professor Joseph Uscinski, who is an associate professor at the University of Miami's political science department. He's also the author of several academic publications. He is also coming to us live from the United States of America. And now, just coming back to this discussion which we were having, I see there's a comment from Nazlu Asmal on Facebook. She says, if it is a conspiracy theory, then why now? Why 2020? Also, before I give the guests an opportunity to respond to this, now before the discussion, we were speaking about, before the ad break rather, we were speaking about the documentary called Plandemic. And now an interesting question which comes up, this question is for you, Dr. van der Linden. Now, is it possible that certain interventions which are meant to combat the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories, such as deleting posts containing fake news off social media and banning conspiracy theorists off the mainstream, such as the removal of David Icke's, that's the famous conspiracy theorist, the removal of his channel from YouTube, is it possible that these actions perhaps achieve the opposite of its purpose, because people who believe and believe wholeheartedly in these theories now have reason to feel that, yes, there is perhaps an effort to silence the truth, or at least what they believe is the truth. And the same in the case of the removal of the Plandemic documentary from basically every platform on which it was uploaded. I think now people who believe in these theories, they now have reason to believe that perhaps there is somebody, some motive at play, aiming to bring down the truth, the so-called truth as they believe it. Dr. van der Linden?
Yeah, there's definitely a certain irony that surrounds the challenge of addressing conspiracy theories, because traditionally every attempt to combat a conspiracy theory is seen as being part of the conspiracy, right? That if you try to combat the conspiracy theory, then you must be part of the conspiracy trying to cover things up. And that's really the dilemma governments and communication officers and social media, well, not social media companies in particular, but many actors are dealing with. That addressing the conspiracy might just lead and further the signal that they are part of the conspiracy, right? If he's being kicked off Facebook, maybe he is being silenced, and it's all true, and some puppet is pulling the strings behind the scenes, and that is a real challenge in terms of addressing conspiracy theories retrospectively or after the fact. And that's, I think, why we in particular have focused on the idea of pre-bunking rather than debunking or inoculation, where you preemptively expose people to a weakened dose of the conspiracy or the techniques used in conspiracy theories to let people build up cognitive antibodies, mental antibodies, to form resistance against these sorts of narratives. So it's much more effective if you immunize, vaccinate people psychologically before they're exposed or attacked with a conspiracy theory, because then people can withstand the persuasive appeal of the conspiracy theory if beforehand you've been inoculated. But if we're trying to undo the damage after you've already been exposed to the conspiracy, that's much more challenging for a variety of reasons. And I'm sure Steve and John and also Joe can talk more about that. But I think there's a lot of value in the preemptive metaphor in terms of preemptively preparing people for future conspiracy theories. For example, now is the perfect time to start protecting people against false conspiracies about the vaccine. I can tell you right now that my prediction is that one of the conspiracies is going to be, and it's difficult for social scientists to make any kind of accurate predictions, but if I had to make one, it's going to be that the vaccine will give you COVID-19. And so, that's going to be one. There's going to be the Bill Gates one is going to morph into even more, ridiculous stories. But we can anticipate what will happen in the future and try to preemptively protect people now, because it's much more difficult to address after the fact. And to answer your question about social media, when users violate the terms of use of social media, whether it's hate speech or spreading dangerous information in other ways, that they will intervene and take more radical actions, such as banning users. But again, it is associated with a host of not what we understand to be backfire effects, but I guess you could call it a backfire effect in that legislating speech, these kinds of policy regulations, finding people, and the sort of the hard measures are sometimes associated with a backlash. And that includes also the filtering algorithmically of content by automatically detecting, for example, conspiracy theories or fake news. A lot of accurate stuff gets flagged by the algorithm because it's difficult to train algorithms to spot manipulation. It's easier to spot, stuff that's obviously fake, but it's much more difficult to spot manipulation. And so often these social media companies will, take down the wrong stuff, and then they get, a lot of public resistance against that. And so they're in a difficult position. But I think when they've made the determination that it's so extreme that they need to ban someone, for example, Alex Jones' channel was banned from YouTube, which they often don't do, but it was misinforming people to such extent that they deemed it dangerous that they've taken those measures. Now, you could argue whether there's better ways to do it. I think a better way to do it is to empower people at the individual level to not be susceptible to conspiracy theories. But at the same time, when things get extreme, sometimes more extreme measures are warranted too. But I'm happy to hear what others think about this.
Would anyone of you, the other panelists, also want to comment on that as well? Okay, so I see we have a question here from Amanda Vidal. So this listener is asking, so as scientists, it is not difficult to imagine the reasons why we have to trust in science, but people without any scientific formation could have a hard time trying to find those reasons. If we know that there is a vaccination denialism, why wouldn't we think that is going to be an inoculation denialism about information? Professor Stephan Lewandowsky, you might want to respond to that comment.
Okay, yeah, I think there are two questions in there. The first one is, why should we trust science? And the second one, then I have to clarify, actually, because I wasn't quite sure what it was. But let me address the trust issue. First of all, if you look at survey data in pretty much any country I know, the US, Europe, Australia, scientists are either the most trusted or among the most trusted profession in all of those countries in surveys. And in fact, contrary to this concern with fake news, we're all going to die from fake news. In actual fact, if you look at survey data in the United Kingdom, trust in scientists and the belief that they tell the truth has gone up in the last 10 or 20 years and is now at about 80% or thereabouts. So I think we do, as scientists, have a reservoir of trust in many countries, most countries I've looked at. And I think that's very important to realize. Now, there are some problems here, in addition to that we have to be aware of. The first one is that the trust data in some countries are very much polarized by politics, and I think Joe can speak to that. He's actually, I think, done some work on that between Democrats and Republicans in the United States, and the data I know suggests that among Republicans, trust in science and scientists is much lower than it is among Democrats. So there is a political problem here with trust, and we also see that now played out with the COVID pandemic, and we see it with vaccinations. We see it everywhere that among American conservatives, there is a declining or decreased trust than among liberals. Now, the other problem with the trust issue is that we have to be very careful, the scientists, to maintain that. And that means, number one, we have to be extremely careful in how we act, and we have to be transparent, and we have to make sure that people understand that. And we also have to understand that there are people out there who will try and reduce trust in scientists. I mean, climate denial is a very clear case where there is an organized campaign to get the public to distrust climate scientists for commercial reasons. The evidence for that is overwhelming. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's something you get out of the peer-reviewed literature and documents, court documents. We know that this disinformation campaign exists, and we have to confront that. So that was my answer to the first question about why trusting, why you should trust scientists. Now, the second question I didn't quite understand that was in there.
Okay, Professor Joseph Uscinski, I just have a question which I would personally want to ask. So my question is, as these shows which we do have to inform and educate the people who are listening and viewing, now for those people, do you think these types of shows are actually effective? Because many people who believe and firmly believe in conspiracy theories might feel that, okay, here's another show, they're probably feeding us the official narrative, the mainstream media narrative once again. They're not going to allow us to voice our truth as well. So do you think that such types of shows are actually effective in informing and educating people about conspiracy theories? Professor Uscinski?
Well, when we think about who's going to believe conspiracy theories, they're not all the same people. So we need to think about who it is we want to reach and with what types of information and what types of interventions. So you can imagine a lot of people out there who aren't paying very close attention to the science, and they might get led astray because they happen to see some conspiracy theory or some piece of misinformation. Perhaps the president says something about drinking, fish tank cleaner, and they think that that might be true. But they don't have a deep sense of, being attracted to conspiracy theories. They don't have any other psychological reasons to be attracted to misinformation, but because of their information environment, that's what they get. And I think those people are fairly easy to get to influence. We could pre-bunk for them, inoculate them from this sort of stuff, give them better media literacy tools. But then you have other sorts of people who they don't really need, to see a conspiracy theory to believe a conspiracy theory. Their worldview is already entrenched in this. And no matter what you tell them, no matter what you do, they are going to be stuck in it. Why? Because everything to them is a conspiracy. So COVID is a conspiracy, and the four of us talking to you right now is part of that conspiracy, and everything they're going to see in the mainstream media is a conspiracy. So the tools to reach that person are going to be very different than the tools to reach your average, person on the street who might get wrong information from time to time. And then there's another issue at play here too, and that is that, yes, people should trust scientists, and most people do, but we do find that there's a tendency from some people to just deny authoritative accounts that are out there. So when they encounter authoritative information, scientific consensus, things like that, they just say, I don't believe it. I'm not going to believe it. And we need to develop tools to get people to know what the right things that they should believe are, and to get them to have less resistance to those right things. And I think that would put us in a much better position than we are in now.
And just before we wrap up this discussion, Professor Cook, I have a question for you as well. So the question is, now a Pew Research report revealed that most Americans believed COVID-19 came about naturally, but 29% believed it was created in a lab. Now, does it concern you at all, Professor Cook, that a sizable portion, more than a quarter of the American population actually buys into a conspiracy theory, Professor Cook?
Yes, it does. And I guess we've touched on this previously. I think Sander talked about it a little bit, but my biggest concern, and there are some really, like you see a lot of footage on TV of things like 5G towers being burned, and quite serious impacts of conspiracy theories. But to me, what really concerns me is this erosion of public trust in institutions and experts, because when you have something like an infectious disease pandemic, and we don't have a vaccine, we don't really have much in the way of effective treatments, then our behavior is the main thing that's protecting society from the pandemic spreading even further. And so our behavior depends on people listening to experts and institutions. So if that trust is going down and if people are less prone to listen to the experts, that's putting everyone in danger. And then following on from that, I think Sandra was also talking about a vaccine coming down the pipeline. My other big concern is that when this vaccine does come, we anticipate that there's going to be a flood of anti-vaccine misinformation at the same time, and the danger of that misinformation basically further eroding public trust in science, experts, and vaccination in general. And if enough people are influenced by that, and not enough proportion of the population get vaccinated, then that prevents us from achieving herd immunity and being able to stop the pandemic.
Yeah, of course. So just 2 minutes left before 8 o'clock South African time. So let's now begin to wrap up. Dr. Sander van der Linden, you might want to begin with your final parting shots, your final word for the listeners. Please try to keep it as brief as possible, perhaps around 30 seconds each. We can start off with you, Dr. Sander van der Linden.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting points we've heard is the rising percentage of people who are endorsing these beliefs. We also did 5 surveys in Europe and found that about a third of the sample believed the bioweapon conspiracy. So that number seems to be very stable. Especially it was higher in Mexico and Spain. But what's interesting is that the 5G conspiracy was less endorsed, maybe about 15% of people. But I think it's important to keep in mind that even though small minorities and to some extent growing minorities are endorsing these beliefs, they can still do a lot of damage in terms of societal impact. And so conspiracy theories are not necessarily harmless, and it's not necessary for the whole population to be convinced by them in order to do real damage. I think that's one of the most important things to keep in mind. Elections are decided on small margins, and so only a fraction of the population needs to be convinced of a conspiracy in order to do some damage. So I think that's one of the most important things for me. The other thing is that I think Joel made a good point about distinguishing audiences, is that yes, we can pre-bond and protect people as much as possible, but there is going to be some segment of the population that we're not going to reach because they have a conspiratorial worldview and they're going to think like that anyway. And the question to the audience and other people is this: is it more effective to try to convince the conspiracy theorists to put all of our resources into protecting the public if we have to divide our resources? And at this point, I think we may be better off trying to protect the public than to convince those who have already convinced themselves that the world is a conspiracy. But it's a big debate. So I think that's one big question for me.
And Professor Stephan Lewandowsky, your final sentiment, as brief as possible, please.
Yeah, stay home and stay safe.
Indeed, that's actually the only way we're going to actually come out of this crisis which we find ourselves in. Professor Joseph Uscinski, your final thoughts as well?
Beliefs can lead to actions, and if beliefs are wrong, then they will lead to actions that are particularly deleterious and disconnected from our shared reality. So try to make sure you listen to the best information from the most knowledgeable sources.
And Professor John Koo?
My advice is, if you want to find out more about this topic, if you're interested in it, what Steve and I have tried to do is make all the research as accessible as possible by summarizing it in the Conspiracy Theory Handbook. So just Google that, the Conspiracy Theory Handbook. And one last thing. We talk about how even if you hear a conspiracy theory and you think, well, that's ridiculous, that can't possibly be true, research has shown that even hearing a conspiracy theory and not believing it can have an influence on your trust in institutions. So be self-aware of the potential influence that conspiracy theories can have on even subconsciously breeding cynicism.
And just quickly before we end, I see a comment which comes in from Yasmin Asmalgar. She says, love the show, and thank you for that kind words, Yasmin. But anyway, that's where we're going to have to leave it for today. So I think we have quite a bit to think about. How do we combat this infodemic without actually making it worse? Making people feel as though the truth is being silenced. That's going to be quite a difficult balance to strike, which the social media companies have to now have a responsibility on their head. That's something particularly interesting to myself. But anyway, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for your time, Professor Stephen Lewandowsky, Professor Joe Uscinski, and Dr. Sander van der Linden, as well as Professor John Cook. Thanks to all of you for your time, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
And that's how we end today's show at 2 minutes past 8 o'clock. Thanks to all of you for tuning in, and thanks to technical producer Sadiq Joseph and Ibrahim Essay. From myself, Zahid Jadwat, and the team, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.